We're good.
Ready. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think you will be in for a real treat this evening listening to our panel. Our first speaker this evening is Rabbi Bobbie Rosenberg. Bobbie, wave your hand. Where are you?
Right here.
There you are. Okay. He is the founder and spiritual leader of Hor HaAlom, a Light to the World synagogue. This came about in 2018 after he identified a need in the Denver metro area for a synagogue that would embrace full inclusion of Jewish youth, especially those with disabilities. He was ordained at Yeshivat HaMivtar, am I saying that right, in 2016. Prior to that, Rabbi earned 3 undergraduate degrees, not 1, but 3, and later a master's degree from Harvard University in religion and religious studies. Among his many interesting jobs prior to becoming a rabbi, he taught at Hinckley High School and Temple Emmanuel. So some of you may already know him. Our second speaker is Joshua Raphael Daugherty, better known as Rafi. He is a psychotherapist working for Queer Asterisk Organization. He is a graduate of the University of Colorado, Denver. He also received a master's degree in crisis and trauma studies from the University of Tel Aviv in Israel. That sounds interesting. He has worked as the director of camper care for Ramah in the Rockies and was the regional manager for Keshet, doing LGBTQ Jewish inclusion work in Colorado. Rafi was raised in an Orthodox home and has 2 children aged 2 and 5. Our third panelist, and hopefully she's going to tune in, is Sable Schultz. Sable is the manager of Transgender Services at the Center on Colfax. Her work includes awareness training and providing resource support services for the trans community in the Denver metro area. She has been doing awareness and advocacy work for the past 15 years. Prior jobs include the Mental Health Center of Denver, University of Denver's Center for Multicultural Excellence, the Movement Advancement Project, and the LGBTQ Student Resource Center on the Auraria campus. Rabbi Bobbie, Rafi, and Sable will each tell us their story in relation to their search for gender identity. We will conclude with Sable if she tunes in. If not, I know both Rafi and Bobbie are very capable of doing this, speaking about resources that are available in the Denver metro area. Please post your questions in the panel, in the chat box for the panelists, and these will be read at the end of our presentation and they will answer them. Thank you so much. We'll start with Rabbi Bobbie.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join everyone this evening and to talk about my story. And I always have to start with the fact that I'm not actually transgender. And I know that a big part of our conversation tonight will be talking about transgender and resources and those journeys. But mine, even though I'm not transgender, there is often a lot of parallels, some overlap in what my experience has been and what many transgender individuals go through themselves. So I'm actually an intersex man. And I don't know how many of you are aware of what intersex is. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the minutia because there's a lot to go into. But when we're talking about intersex, it is an umbrella term. And this is an umbrella term for any condition that makes it difficult to determine what the sex of an individual is supposed to be. And I want to be very specific that this isn't the gender of a person, but the sex. So the intersex community is pretty broad. The conditions are numerous. It can affect anything from hormones to the way the external genitalia develop, to the way the internal reproductive organs develop, as well as the different chromosomes that an individual may have. So when we talk about my story as an intersex man, my story actually goes back to when I was in utero. My story really begins with my mother's pregnancy. And I have a very specific type of intersex condition. It was once known as being a hermaphrodite. The language later changed to ovotesticular disorder of sexual development. And there were many who didn't like that term of disorder. We as individuals are not a disorder. And so some have moved to get that changed to a difference in sexual development. I personally stick with the term intersex. So much easier than doing ovotesticular difference in sexual development, or OTDSD. So intersex. And there are many ways that my particular condition can develop, but mine actually goes back to myself and my twin. So when my mother was pregnant with me, which was a surprise, she was not supposed to be able to have children at all. And when she was pregnant with me, she actually was carrying twins. I absorbed my twin in utero. Apparently we were really close, and we're even closer now. I still carry aspects of my twin with me. So I don't just have my DNA, I have the DNA of my twin as well. When I was born, it was a medical emergency. I was born incredibly premature. And the doctors were not only surprised that I was born premature, but surprised that they could not determine exactly what my gender should be. So that great question everybody asks, boy or girl? The doctors were like, hey, it's a baby. It's a baby. Congrats. Within the medical community, when children are born and they cannot easily be identified as male or female, according to the doctors, they will go through a lot of testing. I went through a lot of testing, and it determined that my karyotype, so the type of chromosomes I have, I was 46XX and 46XY. I was literally split down the center. I am truly half male, half female. And from the medical community's perspective, during that time, and things have changed since then, or they continue to change, the typical treatment would have been to assign me as a girl, do whatever surgical procedures were needed to make me look like a girl, and to raise me as a girl. That's what should have happened according to the doctors. Because I was considered a miracle baby, my parents, they were in the military, and they were stationed in separate areas at that time. My grandparents were also very involved in my early childhood. And they felt that as a miracle baby, I should have a rather traditional upbringing. I needed to go to shul, and I needed to follow all the traditions and have a kosher home, and in the whole 9 yards. I should be dedicated back to Hashem. And with that, because of the level of observance, it became important for the rabbis to get involved. So if ever you get, rabbis in the medical community together on something like intersex conditions, I guarantee that not everybody is going to walk out on the same page, and such was the case with me. The rabbis determined I should be a boy, the opportunity for mitzvot, and at the bare minimum, I met the requirements to be considered a male. The doctors, however, said, this kid may not grow up to be such a happy guy. It'd be much easier to make this child a girl. And so I had both experiences, which is pretty rare. That is not the recommendation, by the way. It's not usually, trial and error, pick girl for a little bit, then boy, and see what happens. What actually happened was, while my parents were stationed away, my grandparents went with the ruling of the rabbis. The poskim ruled I was a boy, and my grandparents said, Bobby is a boy. Thus, Baruch. So I am Baruch Simcha. In my very Hasidic side of the family, I will always be Baruch Simcha and nothing other than that. When my parents left the military, my mother was discharged first, and she came back, and I went back to live with my mom full time. And then later my father was discharged. They were a bit concerned because the medical community was noting the difficulties that I would have. And so it was suggested to send me the direction of being a girl. And so around the age of 4.5 or 5, I transitioned from being Baruch Simcha to being Saitopatya, which is a big difference. And to this day, I actually have all those Hebrew names as part of my identity. But I started this transition of being a girl. And I know my parents had their, it was my best interest at heart, what was going to be easier and best for me medically speaking. What they realized was that I very much was not your typical girl. I did not like wearing the dresses. I did not want to put little barrettes in my hair and ribbons and get my nails done and play with cute pink frilly things. That was not me. I really was the stick some shorts and a t-shirt on me, send me outside and let me run around and tear up the earth. It's great. I was not going to go so easily towards being a girl. When I went to school, I have Asperger's, so I am autistic, and it was best for me to go to a public school where I could get my needs met, and then to do Hebrew school off to the side. During that time, I went from really just being stuck with, I'm a boy, but I'm going to play around and do whatever we want. It didn't matter in kindergarten because everybody shared a bathroom, and it wasn't until I got older that I realized the teachers absolutely saw me as a little girl. But a lot of my friends saw me as a young boy. That's who I was. So I had instances where, like the first time I went to the bathroom in first grade, I got lost. A young boy showed me where the bathroom was, helped me wash my hands because I couldn't reach the sink. It was great. And I walked out and was immediately yelled at by a teacher who wanted to let me know that I was to never go into that bathroom again. That bathroom was only for little boys, and I was a girl. That was the first time that I really understood that I wasn't supposed to be a boy. I was supposed to be this girl. And I did my best. I still fought the dresses, and my parents relented, and fine, I could wear pants and a t-shirt, and that's that. Going forward, it became more of a battle. And I think they were just like, okay, you're a tomboy. And that was my comfort level. I didn't have to call myself a girl. They didn't refer to me as a girl. They said, oh, Bobbie's a tomboy, no big deal. And what I heard in my little head was, boy. They finally acknowledged I was a boy. So when I went to the Hasidic side of my family who only saw me as a boy, and I went back to the non-Hasidic side of my family who saw me as a tomboy, it didn't matter because I was still a boy. And so I went quite some time as the tomboy. That's who I was supposed to be. And I want to be respectful of times. I know other presenters, so I'm going to do the fast forward where I basically get to the point where as I'm determining my Jewish path and where I want to go and who I want to be, it became important for me to understand that, yes, my gender identity was a huge part of that. And I very much identified as a man. I very much wanted to embrace that, the Hasidic side of my family and the mitzvot. And so I made the decision to go back to being Baruch Simcha, that little boy that my grandparents and raised for so long and knew me as. And so to this point now, my journey has been, I can absolutely say I understand what it is to walk in the footsteps of a woman, but I absolutely understand what it is to walk in the footsteps of a man. And so for me, identify as an intersex man, especially within Judaism, I think I have an interesting perspective, one that allows me to relate to multiple people on multiple levels. But I very much identify as a man, and I love the fact that I was able to go through this journey and really embrace my Jewish identity and have the support from my Jewish community in the decisions that I made.
Good. Thank you very much. Now we'll go on to Rafi.
All right. Hello, I'm Rafi, and good to see the people that I was able to see. It's always hard to figure out which parts of my story to cram into the amount of time that we have. So Bobbie, good work going ahead of me. So I am a transgender man. And so when I was born, it was very clear that I was a female child, a female baby. And my mom had always wanted a daughter. She had a name chosen since she was a teenager before I was born. And I had an older brother, so they felt, I think, like their family was complete. They had a boy, they had a girl. Great. Um, so, my earliest memories around gender were wishing that I was a boy. Um, some transgender people have the experience of knowing. They knew that they were their gender. Some transgender people don't know till they're much older. And some transgender people are like me, where it was more like a wish. I wish I was a boy. Um, the message I got as a child, and I don't know whether my mother said this directly to me or if it was just a thing I heard, was kind of like, well, everyone wishes that they were a boy. It may have been everyone wishes they were a boy when they have to pee in the woods. But what I heard was everyone would rather be a boy than a girl. Being a girl sucks, and you just have to get over it and just make the best of your life anyway. And so that's really what I thought. Um, so that was kind of the thing that kind of stayed with me as I got older and older. But kind of going back to early childhood, um, one thing that I always find important to share when I tell my story is that I was not an extremely masculine child. I liked pink and purple. I played with dolls. I did not like Barbies, but I played with like baby dolls. I've always been a very nurturing person, so my play almost always revolved around being a parent or a caretaker of some sort. Um, and I liked music, and I liked arts and crafts and things like that. I didn't do kind of stereotypical boy activities. Um, and in terms of the girl activities, was mostly just playing with baby dolls. I didn't do princesses or glitter or dresses and sparkles. That wasn't really my deal. So anyway, I always find that important to mention because I think there are a lot of ideas about how transgender people are, and maybe that they've always been this way or they've always looked a certain way. And I don't think and I know that it's not that clear for a lot of us. So um, so my Jewish history is actually more complicated than my gender history, I often say. My dad was Seventh-day Adventist. My mom was a secular Jew. They were married, and then marriage was rocky. My mom had started doing Seventh-day Adventist things, but then when I was about 3, she had kind of a spiritual revelation and started taking us to Temple Shalom down in Colorado Springs. And then we moved up to Denver when I was 5. Parents got divorced, and then we started kind of embarking upon a more intense Jewish journey, which did eventually lead to us becoming Orthodox when I was 10, about 10. And I went to Hillel Academy in Denver for a few years, and then we moved to St. Louis when I was like 10, 11. So when my brother was bar mitzvah, this is, one of my kind of pivotal memories around my gender. I was about 10 when my brother was bar mitzvah. And, I had already wished I was a boy. I had already dressed up as a boy for Purim multiple years in a row. And when my brother had his bar mitzvah, I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and I watched everything he did. And we didn't have a good relationship. I watched everything he did because I was so jealous of what he was being able to do. I tried to learn his bar mitzvah trope, and I woke up in the middle of the night to try on his tefillin because I saw him doing it, and I was like, I could do that. And I would put on his kippah or his tzitzis, and I had a very strong connection to the male Jewish ritual stuff that I didn't really understand. I couldn't really put a word to it, and I felt like it was bad or devious because I was a girl and I shouldn't want to do those things. So I would say what I usually tell in my story is that about that same age, around age 10, I realized Santa Claus wasn't coming, and that I wasn't going to get transformed into a boy overnight, and that I would just have to make do with being a girl and do the best job I could. So I kind of shoved that part of me down as best as I could, and I tried not to think about it too much. And I was in all girl environments all the time, and a lot of people oh, that must have been terrible to be have to be in all girl environments. And the truth is that I felt much, much better in all girl environments because I got to be kind of like what Bobbie was saying about being the tomboy. I got to be the tomboy around all the girls. So when I was around all the girls, it was obvious that I was the one who was more masculine. It affirmed my masculinity in certain ways, even though I didn't have words to express what any of that was or what it meant, but I can look back and see that. And when I was around people who were born male and raised as boys, I always felt insecure. I always felt like they were going to see that they were going to see that I was weak or that I wasn't cool or whatever it was. So yeah, that was growing up. Um, Went to Orthodox day schools throughout, starting from first grade at Hill Academy. Went to a school called Torah Prep in St. Louis, Missouri. Went to Beis Yaakov High School, which is like ultra Orthodox Jewish girls' high school, if people aren't familiar. And the gender stuff would kind of come up here and there, but I did my best. Like there was just nothing I could do about it. I was raised in a very sheltered place. I didn't know any gay or lesbian people. My mom would sometimes make homophobic comments, but I didn't usually understand them. Definitely had no idea that transgender was anywhere on the radar, anything that was even within the realm of possibilities. So if I ever had a thought about it, it was like, well, that's too bad. You just kind of had to shove it down. In 11th grade, I finally was able to put to words that, because I had a strong desire to wear pants, but the way I was being raised was that wearing pants was sinful. And so if I had a desire to wear pants and wearing pants is sinful, that means I'm sinful. That means there's something wrong with me. So when I told one of my 11th grade teachers, and she was just a young thing right out of seminary, she was like 18 years old. And, but I would confess all my deepest, darkest feelings and thoughts to her. And she was so precious. And, but when I told her that I really just, that wearing, the way I described it was wearing skirts and dresses hurts my bones. That was the only way I could describe, and now I know there's a word for it called gender dysphoria. But back then I didn't know, and all I could say was it hurts my bones. There's a deep aching discomfort for me when I wear dresses and skirts. And mind you, I had only ever worn dresses and skirts since I was 6, because I was raised in a community where girls only wore dresses and skirts. But there was something in me that knew that if I wore pants, I would feel more comfortable. So that was like kind of the start of a really rocky time in my life. Started drinking and using drugs when I had the opportunity to, smoking. There was a point where I was self-harming, I was cutting myself. And I would say there's some of that was related to gender. I think a lot of it was raised to childhood trauma. A lot of it was a result of childhood trauma and mental illness and things like that, and kind of a genetic propensity towards addiction. And so those next few years were just kind of confusing in a lot of different ways. But I had my first girlfriend when I went to Israel for seminary. And one of the most wonderful things about that was she would call me her husband. And so when I would call the seminary to talk to her, because I ended up getting kicked out for different reasons, when I would call, she would say, oh, my husband's on the phone. And I would just get this, I would feel elated, and didn't have words for any of that experience. So that was kind of how gender played in to some of that. And when I was 20 or 21, moved to New York. I'd been in Israel for a couple of years, was back in St. Louis for a year, and then moved to New York. And I had gotten sober. I was in recovery, and I was at one of my 12-step meetings, and someone pointed to another man, to a guy in the room, and said, that guy used to be a girl. My mind was blown. I did not know that was a thing that could happen. And so I saw this handsome man, young guy, or, just a little bit older than myself, there with a little beard and everything. And I had no idea that someone could do that. And my first thought was, I would be transgender if I wasn't Orthodox. And then I just wiped that idea out. I wrote it down in a journal that I saw many years later, but I just tried to forget it as quickly as I could, because my next thought was, oh, but God doesn't make mistakes. So I can't be transgender. So the next few years were really me struggling with that aspect of myself, me meeting more transgender people, wishing I could be transgender, but feeling like I couldn't because God didn't do that to me. And it was hard. And I thought maybe this is childhood trauma. Maybe I'm not really transgender. It's childhood trauma. If I just deal with the childhood trauma, then I'll be enjoying being a woman. And I went to a therapist who was an Orthodox woman, and she kind of seemed like she believed the same thing. And she would send me to get manicures as part of my therapy. And we tried to deal with the trauma stuff, and like it just nothing shifted. I still was feeling the same way as I felt before. And eventually, like the place of Orthodox Judaism in my life lost its importance. It didn't kind of match where I was in my life at that point. What was more relevant was the spirituality I gained through 12-step program and staying sober and trying to find out more about who I was. And as Orthodox Judaism fell off, I had the thought again of like, oh, maybe I'm transgender. And the reason I said I wouldn't be is because I was Orthodox, but now I'm not Orthodox anymore. So maybe I should give this transgender thing a try. And I had a fear that being transgender wouldn't help, that I would like transition and still feel like I wasn't okay. And then why would I have done all that to myself if I still wouldn't feel okay? But read a bunch of books, talked to a bunch of people. I was lucky to be in New York. I was able to access a support group for transgender men. I was able to access healthcare that was a lot of transgender people have a hard time accessing healthcare towards transition. I was lucky enough to be in New York where there was a special clinic for trans folks, and we could just, like informed consent. They would let us know, here's the risks, here's the advantages, go ahead and you can choose if that's what you want, sign on the dotted line. There used to be a lot more gatekeeping, and in some places there still is, where people need to live as a trans person for a year before they're allowed to access any of the medical care, which makes really no sense. So that was in 2007. I came out as transgender. My Orthodox family had a very, very, very difficult time with this. Some of them still do. I have one older brother who's a biological sibling, and he has not spoken to me since 2007. He has 10 children, and I don't know them. They don't know me. My mom really, really struggled for quite a while. There were a few years where she couldn't really bring herself to speak to me, but she was able to, through the help of a rabbi and I think some therapy, she was able to come to accept me and be in my life again. And now she and I have a great relationship, and she's she's my kid's Bobbie, and she comes to visit when it's not COVID times, and they get to see her, and she's really come a long way. She leads a group for other parents she leads a group for Orthodox parents of transgender individuals now, in St. Louis, where she lives. And yeah, it's been huge to watch her grow through that. I'm trying to think like what else feels most relevant, but I went to Israel for that degree, and it was really wonderful to be back in Israel as my authentic self. The first time I was there at 18, I was really struggling. I was really in a bad place, and I didn't know why. I didn't know what was wrong with me, or I didn't fit, and I didn't know why I didn't fit. So going back as kind of feeling complete and feeling authentic was really magical. And I do plan to move back and to live there one day. And then in terms of having kids, because that's usually the part that's most interesting to people. Like I said, I was always a very parental person, even as a small human. And I always knew I wanted kids. And I thought that growing them in my body would be like the coolest science experiment ever. And I always thought that, like even before transition. And I wasn't like married to the idea of having biological children, but I thought it would be really cool. I've always been interested in fostering and adopting as well. But it ended up just the way things kind of lined up in my life. I did become a foster parent for a little while in 2014. But I wanted to try the pregnancy thing. So I got pregnant with my daughter at the end of 2014, and she's 5.5 now. And I have my son who's almost 3. He'll be 3 in May. And my experience of being a pregnant dude is that there's male privilege even in pregnancy. That's one thing I'll say. I think that women have to contend with a lot of people like touching them or like making comments about their pregnancy or giving them unsolicited advice about pregnancy or childbirth. And people didn't know I was pregnant. I just looked like I'd had a few too many pizzas and beers. And I think being fat helped too. I think if I was a skinny guy when I was pregnant, it would have been harder. Yeah, I really like, it was pretty uncomplicated. I did not have a lot of negative attention from people. People just figured I was just a very overweight dude. And I was very lucky in that my healthcare providers were all pretty respectful. I did a lot of work to make sure I was getting healthcare workers that were respectful, made sure they knew what transgender was before I came in. When I was at the hospital, at Rose Hospital, having my babies, I had a sign on the door that explained what was going on, so the doctors or anyone who walked in really could look at the sign and close it up so other patients didn't have to see it. So when they walked in and saw a bearded man sitting on the hospital bed with a baby, they weren't like, "Did you eat your wife?" Because it wouldn't be good to eat your wife after she had a baby. So yeah, so for the most part, had really great experiences with that. Just the food people didn't always know because they were carrying things with their hands, so they didn't always see the note. So I did have a couple of like just kind of surprised looks, but for the most part, people were really great.
Thank you, Rafi.
You're welcome.
Did Sable ever tune in? Lisa, do you know? I don't believe she has. Let me.
No, and I sent an email as well. So
Okay. I think that's fine. We have two very capable people. First of all, Bobbie and Rafi, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. Most of the people who come to lifelong learning are my age. We probably have children and grandchildren your age. What advice would you give us if we think that one of our family members might be transgender or considering it? And what resources are there in the community? Bobbie, do you want to start?
So I don't know that I'm actually the best person for answering in terms of transgender. Let me go ahead and take it in terms of intersex and more from parents who give birth to an intersex baby, or understanding that intersex conditions can also be identified later in life. So sometimes it's not identified until closer to puberty, sometimes not until adulthood. So in terms of that, person that, baby comes into the world and it's not 100% sure if the baby is going to be male or female. There's an intersex condition going on. In terms of the parents or the parent, whoever is handling that part, it's a conversation between the medical community, also consult rabbis, and then to really think about what would be best for the child. So I typically will say anything where doctors suggest surgery, which is usually one of the first things that come up, unless it's like a life-threatening emergency where surgery is needed, then my suggestion would be for the parents to wait. Let the child grow up a little bit. I probably started displaying that I was very much a boy prior to realizing that my grandparents were even considering me a boy. Kids actually will display their gender preferences much earlier than people realize. So there's also that part there, listening to the kid. If the child is, if you're like, "Hi, Judy," and Judy is saying, "Yo, call me Joe," I really feel more like Joe. The child isn't just going through a phase. The child is actually expressing who they are, and we have to learn to listen to our youth. Age doesn't mean we can't listen to them. And so just because a person is small or young doesn't mean they don't know what they're feeling. So being open to listening to what the child is saying and engaging in those age-appropriate conversations. There's always ways to make things age-appropriate. And then if it's, a condition that is identified later in life, either in puberty or in adulthood, then being open to what does the future look like? What do you feel like? So individuals who have been raised and feel like they are very much a woman, but they find out they have an intersex condition where their chromotype is actually XY. Every part of them is very much a woman. The doctors are saying, "Hey, BT dubs, you're a guy," right? Listening to that patient. it's not just what's on paper. It's not just what the test determine. It's really who that person says they are. So I think the biggest thing is being open to listening, and postponing things like surgeries until later, when conversations can be had with the intersex individual and letting them determine what's best for their bodies.
Thank you. And Rafi?
Yeah, thanks, Bobbie. I'm really glad you're here to talk about that. It's something I'm passionate about as well. It's not doing surgeries on babies without their consent, unless it's obviously important for their immediate health. So I think a great story to tell, given what you said about the audience here, is that my grandmother was one of the last people I told. My father's mother, who was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, she was one of those grandmothers who always sent a birthday card, always sent her check, a little check in the birthday card, and would call me by my full name, that kind of thing. And she was just very sweet. And I was afraid to tell her. I thought, either she'd reject me, or, I think we get this idea about people that are older, like, oh, if I tell them they're going to have a heart attack, like there's some kind of like ailment that older people have that if they hear news, they'll just die on you or something. So I was really scared to tell her. And it became awkward because she would call me. I was living in New York, and she would call me wonderful voice messages and using my birth name. And I didn't want to call her back because I didn't want to have to address myself as that name and say, hi, Grandma, it's, using my birth name. But I also didn't feel ready to tell her I was transgender. And after a couple months of that, I really started feeling like a bad person. And what I realized was that if she rejected me, that was her choice. And that at least I'm putting the ball in her court instead of having the ball stay in my court and I'm just not contacting my grandmother. So I ended up sending her an email. So I was glad she was tech savvy, because I don't know if I could have done a phone call. But I sent her an email and explained that I was transgender and why. And her response was the best response I got from any family member, hands down. She said, I'm sorry you were suffering. I hope that you're happier now. Please come visit me. And that was it. So simple, so loving. So my suggestion for anyone who has a child or a grandchild who might be gender nonconforming or transgender, I'm a big fan of people asking outright. What I would say is that if you're noticing it, the kid knows that they're not kind of presenting in a typical way. So if you're noticing that they're a little androgynous or they don't prefer things that most girls or boys prefer, it's okay to say like, hey, I noticed that you seem to like this more than other things. Do you want to tell me anything about that? I think there's so many people who would tell their parents or grandparents if they felt they could, and having any kind of opening is so great, so that they can say, oh yeah, actually, this is something I wanted to tell you but felt too scared to bring up, and then they have a place to say it.
Good point. Bobbie, this question is for you. Did your mother use fertility medications in order to conceive?
No. It was very much a surprise to my mom, to my dad, to the military, to the entire family. It was actually just one of the rare times her body decided that it would actually ovulate. And so very much in our family, a miracle. I have adopted brothers and sisters, and the last two are also twins. And not adopted. Yeah, so they're my biological siblings. They weren't adopted. And that was the one time that my parents actually did get a little help to make sure that they could have success. But for me, I was the grand surprise.
And then I think this question comes from people who didn't quite hear you at the beginning. How can a transgender man get a male Hebrew name? But I think you explained that. So if you just quickly want to explain that you're not transgender.
Yeah. So I was born intersex. So for those who missed that part, intersex being an umbrella term for a number of different conditions that alter the way a baby or an individual develops sexually. So if they would be considered sexually male or sexually female, it can be a change in the chromosomes, in the hormone levels, in the internal reproductive organs, or the external genitalia and the way that they develop. So when I was given a male name, it was because the poskim, the rabbis, who my grandparents were consulting, determined that halakhically I would be considered a male. And so I actually had many, many names. The final iteration of my Hebrew name as a male was Baruch Simcha, and that my name changed quite a bit when I was born at 25 weeks. I was not expected to survive. And so my name consistently changed to avoid the angel of death, which is fairly traditional. And so the last name that I had that we ended on when it was pretty clear that I was going to survive was Baruch Simcha. I did actually have a bris it was not at 8 days, it was much later when I was physically able to do so. That was a decision that my grandparents made for me. When my parents took over my care, so my parents were in the military, they were not supposed to be together. My dad was an officer, my mother was not. The military does not always look fondly upon that. And while they say that they did not punish my parents, they were stationed on separate sides of the earth. So, depends on how you look at it. But when my mother was discharged, when she came back and was able to take over my care, because I was in the hospital for quite some time, it was then when she took over my care that the Hebrew name she chose for me was Sable Schultz. So that's why I have two names. But Baruch Simcha was my first name that we stuck with, and because I was intersex.
Thank you. Rafi, were you on testosterone prior to getting pregnant? Do you know the child's donor?
Yeah, I'll answer that, but I also wanted to answer about transgender men getting a male Hebrew name because I did that. So my name was not Rafi before, but when I came out, I knew I wanted it to be Rafi. And I had a couple of moments of like feeling that I was being led by God or by a higher power around my name. And I ended up being Rachamim Raphael Yehoshua. So I gave myself the name, and then had, there's an LGBT synagogue in New York called CBST. And I did a kind of a renaming ceremony there on a Friday night in 2007. It was beautiful. It was lovely. So now when I get called to the Torah, that's my name. So yes, I was on testosterone starting in 2007. And then I stopped in 2012 to pursue my pregnancy dreams. And the donor is a good friend of mine. Yes, and he's in my child's lives. They know who he is. They know what his role was. We call him Chachaji. He's Hindi. So he's wonderful.
Nice. Do you think if someone comes out as transgender prior to puberty, it would be wise to start them on hormones so that they don't go through puberty as the opposite gender? How would you determine that since they are young?
Happy to talk
I
about
wonder
this
if you could answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And so the first thing to know is that if a person comes out as transgender before puberty, you don't start them in the opposite sex's hormones. What they can do if a person comes out before puberty is put them on hormone blockers. And what that does is it gives their body a kind of like it becomes like a no-go zone for hormones so that they can have a little more time to live in the gender that they want to be, and kind of have them make sure, have the family make sure, have everyone kind of on board that they are who they say they are and that they want what they say they want. So that at age sometimes 14, sometimes 16, depends on the doctor, they can start cross-sex hormones. The main thing that they consider with that is that when someone doesn't go through their natal puberty and does go on to cross-sex hormones, they do, I think there's not enough research, but it seems pretty clear that people lose their ability to be fertile at that point. So unlike for myself, who had gone through a regular puberty and lived quite a few years having that kind of body and life, when I went off testosterone, my body went straight back into doing its thing. But when someone does cross-sex hormones after being on blockers, that's not as clear, and they can lose their fertility. So they want to make sure that the person can really decide that they're okay with that before they can start them on cross-sex hormones. So prior to puberty, kids can go on blockers. Post-puberty, they can do cross-sex hormones, but they will still might have to deal with some of the effects of their original puberty. And it is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's hard to determine. So like Bobbie said, you usually follow the child's lead, let them kind of determine how they want to live, ask them the questions, and follow what they seem to want.
And a couple of people who say, yay, Rafi's grandmother, with exclamation. For Rafi, how did you get past the thinking of God doesn't make mistakes? In other words, how do you explain why transgender happens?
Thanks. And I would love to hear Bobbie's like take on this as well for intersex. But I think that, you know, I had lost my Orthodox leaning and had kind of stopped imagining God as being as involved with our lives as I had originally thought that God was. And I think that gave me the space in the room to say that if there is a God out there, that God would want me to be happy and would want me to live my best life and want me to be authentic. So that was kind of the start of it for me. And also God, I think I started realizing that there's a lot of things that some people think are mistakes and that I don't think are mistakes. When I meet a person with a disability, let's say, some people might say, oh, that person with a disability, that's some kind of mistake. And when I meet a person with a disability, my heart is open to them. And there's something that to me is like, there's a certain perfection or a certain wisdom in the diversity of creation. So I think that's part of what happened for me as well. And I will say on another like positive note, one of the rabbis from the second seminary I attended in Israel, very, very, very from Orthodox man. His name was actually Baruch, and Baruch Smith. And he, wonderful South African man. And when I came in 2009 to Israel the first time to visit as a transgender man, he heard from a friend that I was in town and told the friend that I should call. And I called and he said, you're going to come visit me. And I said, oh, I don't know. I was going to like go buy some tchotchkes. And he was like, what? It's more important buying tchotchkes or coming to see your old rabbi? So I went to go see my old rabbi. The guilt worked on me. And when I went to see him, he welcomed me with open arms. He said, Rafi. He used my chosen name in a beautiful, loving way. And he said, he looked me up and down. He looked me deep in the eyes and he said, I don't know why Hashem makes people transgender, but I know that you're at peace now. I can see that. I can see that this is the real you. So I would say, like, I don't know. I don't know why Hashem makes people transgender, if God makes people transgender, but I know that like the people that I've seen go through transition come out with a certain inner peace that is godly. There's something holy about that. And yeah, I'd love to turn it over to Bobbie too.
And probably for both of you, what Jewish rituals and texts do you feel connected to and that support your identities?
So I know, Robbie, I wanted me just to speak on the previous one. So let me jump on that real fast. And I think I'm kind of the same way as you, Robbie, that I don't know. I never really understood, why was I born intersex? Why is anyone born intersex or transgender for that matter? But I kind of credit my family that we've always been very connected to Torah and being able to go back and like my Zadie, going back and going, Adam himself, right? The original creation had this component of both Adam and Chava in one being. Mm-hmm. And if the original creation was this beautiful creation, a mixture of two, then why should I look at myself as being a mistake? I shouldn't. I was basically created the same way as Adam, right? And having that as being part of my identity, knowing that like I could pull from Torah, there's another person that was just like me, that everyone's descended from, right? was really huge for me and really made me feel special. So instead of looking at being intersex as being this burden or a mistake that happened, it was a glitch in nature or whatever, I looked at it as an opportunity for me to connect to a person in the Torah that a lot of people probably could never connect to in a way that I can. So I can't explain why God does what he does, or what God does, but I can say that I don't look at being intersex or being transgender as a mistake, rather an opportunity for us to expand our views on gender, expand our views on what it is to be human and to interact with one another and to do these mitzvot.
Are there any specific rituals and texts that you feel connected to that support your identity? I guess that would be more for Rafi.
Well, I think that, you know, what Bobbie just talked about with the original kind of creation story is a text that is very supportive of trans and intersex identities in a lot of ways. I don't have one specific one. It is really interesting to look back through, especially as someone who's raised Orthodox, looking back through the Torah with a queer lens, which is something working with Keshet. Like Keshet does a lot of that work. And if anyone wants to check, speaking of resources, if anyone wants to check out Keshet's resources, it's www.keshetonline.org. And they have a lot of texts and resources and things like that that are really helpful for queer and trans people to find themselves within Torah and within Judaism. There's not one particular one that speaks to me. I would say that I have a certain fascination with the ritual of mikvah, but I felt that it was very inaccessible to me as a trans person, because which mikvah do I use, right? I don't feel comfortable going to a public mikvah with other men. It would feel very, I know, like Bobbie and I have actually talked about this before. I don't feel super comfortable calling and asking for a private time to do the women's mikvah. So, but at times when I have been able to access that, that's a ritual that feels really significant to me as like this is a change agent, like the water itself is a change agent on some level and helps me in my process of change.
So in relation to that, have you discussed that with any of the mikvahs? Would they be open to holding a time for transgender people?
I never have, Bobbie.
Okay.
I can actually speak to that. So prior to getting married, it was very important for me to go to the mikveh. That was going to be the start of my mikveh experiences going forward. And but I also was not going to go to the public time for the guys to go splish around. I did not feel that comfortable in my intersex body. So I actually called up Aish. And Aish is incredibly open and amazing. I explained that I was intersex. I wanted to mikveh before my wedding, and I would like to schedule a time. I do not want to mikveh with the other men. And the attendant was like, absolutely, this is a day we can get you in. And I would come during the time that men would go to mikveh, so it wasn't a big deal. And she's like, we'll have a special room for you. You can get ready. And not only did they have a special room for me, but they had like the groom kit. It was adorable. A little box with like the little bow tie and tax thing and cute little gifts for me, congratulating me as a groom. And I basically had the entire place to myself for about an hour. And they're like, take your time, have fun, enjoy this moment. They gave me the best place to, spruce myself up to get naked before mikvahing. So it was actually a really, really positive experience, to the point where when I was working at Emmanuel, we would have our excursions to the mikvah as part of the field trip. It was great. She would reconnect with me. How's your wife doing? And when are we going to see you again? We can always reserve the time anytime you want. And she would actually make it a point to make sure the kids also knew that, like, we make special accommodations. If you don't feel comfortable going to the mikvah when you're able, when you're at that point in front of everybody, they will make accommodations for you. So I would say Aish was incredibly accommodating. And that's why, anyone who wants to go that doesn't feel comfortable, be it because they're intersex or they're transgender, I always recommend Aish. But I'm sure there might be other mikvahs out there that would make accommodations. It's just a matter of calling.
Great. Bobbie, in your case, did you find, and in Rafi's, do you find it difficult to find and establish romantic relationships?
Do you want to go first, or?
Sure.
Yeah, I was actually going to answer it in chat just in case we didn't have time.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say I am extremely picky, and I also have 2 small children. So dating is very, very hard to come by for me. I don't think if I was less picky and didn't have 2 small children, I think I'd probably be pretty busy in the dating field if I wanted to be. But I would say, like, being Jewish, being trans, being sober, having 2 kids, wanting to live in Israel, like there's just so many criteria there. And then plus there needs to be chemistry and attraction. That just feels like a lot to ask for. But there's hope. I'm not one of, like, I think that, similar to the way gender and sex and sexuality are spectrums, how much someone desires a romantic relationship is also on a spectrum. And I'm on the side of the spectrum that's like, yeah, it would be nice. That's it, like that's it. It would be nice. I'm not one of those people who kind of pines after love or anything like that. I'm like, oh, it'd be cool. It'd be nice to have an extra set of hands around and other parts of the bodies too, but that's cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
I don't know that so I didn't have trouble dating or finding dates. I had trouble understanding how to date. I'm just a horrible dater. Like I clam up. I typically won't ask people out, or they'll ask me out, and I'll be like, I don't know, I'm busy, might have to wash my hair. I really am just horrible at dating. So when with Tamara and I, when we started dating, once we figured out that like the first date was really a date, as well as the second and the third, it became so much easier. And because we started dating and we were talking as friends, I was able to talk to her very early on in our dating process to explain that I was intersex and what that meant, which, I mean, she's very knowledgeable. So it really wasn't like, let me explain everything from scratch. That made it easier. I have had other experiences when I was younger, in my teens, specifically when I first went off to college and dating, that it became a bit awkward in knowing how early do you bring up, by the way, it's not something that happens on your first date. Hi, I'm Bobbie, intersex, good to meet you. So how early do you like bring this up? Is it worth it? But
honestly, Bobbie, you kind of are that person who does that. So I'm just going to say that.
Okay, but now, right? Like I totally have to wear the big eye because just so I have to be out there. But I think when I was much younger, I was also incredibly shy. And so, if I did go on a date and it progressed further, there was always the awkward conversation of, I have to tell you something really important. I don't know how you're going to take this. So for me, the dating part wasn't hard. It was, when do you have the conversation? That became the challenge.
As a former insurance executive, I'm wondering if there were any issues you faced when purchasing either life or health insurance. That could be either one of you.
So I answered that privately as well, just because I didn't know how much time we'd have.
Oh, okay.
But for anyone else who's curious, when pre-existing conditions were still a thing and you couldn't get coverage if you had a pre-existing condition, being transgender was a pre-existing condition. So back in the day, I had friends who couldn't go see a doctor for strep throat because they were transgender. They couldn't get coverage for just daily life things. They didn't have any other conditions, just they happened to be transgender. So they couldn't get health coverage. And with life insurance, I'm still confused because the rates are different depending on your sex. So I still don't know which one I'm supposed to choose if I get life insurance.
So for me, medical insurance, it was always through my parents. She had it when I was born, so it wasn't a big deal. I didn't have issues until later, when I became an adult and I started getting my own insurance. And then it was a matter of, do they classify me as purely male or male-ish, because I got a little female going on. And so it always became more of an interesting battle with what types of exams I can have and how they build a medical insurance company and why they have to explain why they are checking for like, so I have internally, I have a testy and an ovary. So I have one of each. It's great. But, explaining to the insurance company why this patient, classified male, is having their ovary examined, it's kind of weird, especially when they also examine the testy and they're like, come on, people, what's going on? That part was difficult. As for life insurance, the only time I actually had life insurance was when I was younger, before I got married. My parents did life insurance on us, and they were smart. They marked female specifically for the lower rate. Yeah, I can't get away with that now.
We would have had a transgender woman on. I'm not sure what happened to her. I hope everything's okay with her. But Bobbie and Rafi, you certainly took care of all that on your own. The two of you, you were wonderful. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of us at Temple Sinai so very much for sharing your experiences with us. I think it's very important that we all understand what you have gone through, that we understand transgender as well as gay and lesbian, and that we can help people within the Jewish community to feel welcome in our synagogues. So thank you very much to both of you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Please be sure and come in 2 weeks to another Lifelong Learning. And we appreciate that you tuned in tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Lois, stay on for 1 sec.
Okay.
Thank you very much. This